It goes. Alrighty, well, hello everyone. Welcome to another edition of 1+1, your place for inconvenient truth-telling and myth-busting. And joining me today is returning champion David Swanson, the host of Talk World Radio on Pacifica Radio and his own YouTube channel and SoundCloud. He's a high-ranking member of World Beyond War, a great peace group, an anti-imperialist, anti-war organization. He's also part of RootsAction.org and the author of several books, like Leaving World War II Behind and When the World Outlawed War. Fantastic books. NATO, what you need to know, what you need to do, with his co-author, Code Pink's Medea Benjamin. War is never just, war is a lie, war no more, the case for abolition, and killing is not a way of life. And check out his website, davidswanson.org, where he blogs regularly, as well as World Beyond War's website. And we are also joined by first-time guest Michael Tracy, an independent journalist, reporter, and a commentator whose writings have been in several libertarian publications. He's a former TYT reporter and interviewer, and he also has his own Substack. And yes, and we are here to discuss how Donald Trump, not your savior, Donald Trump is no peacenik. And while one that can be disgusted with the Democrats, don't ever be so foolish to think that Trump is some Ron Paul fiscally regressive socioeconomics person, but is a very good anti-imperialist peacenik, which is simply wrong, and dead mother effing wrong. So first off, gentlemen, thank you for joining me today, and Michael, special thank you to you for also joining us on such short notice.
Yeah, happy to do it. Great to be here. Pleasant surprise to be on with Michael.
Fantastic. Well, so the first question, and we'll do this. So when I ask the question, David, you'll be the first to respond, and then followed by Michael. So my first question is this. David, can you explain to an audience why Donald Trump is not a peacenik? And then after that, Michael, can you also respond and say to people why Donald Trump is no peacenik, and he's certainly not our savior?
Well, I cannot say anything legally about any electoral candidates on behalf of any organization, no matter how I'm introduced. But speaking as myself, a human being with no particular obligations to any governments, what the hell are these people thinking if Donald Trump is a peace candidate? I don't think I can explain anything to anyone who has given their loyalty to Donald Trump, or perhaps any other candidate, because I think they're beyond rationality. But you take a guy who comes in, who's done this gig 4 years in the White House already, who comes in promising to end the war in Afghanistan. Instead, he ends the policy of not sending weapons to Ukraine. A guy who not only continues and escalates and increases the U.S. weapons sales to horrible dictatorial governments around the world, but practically does a Broadway show with giant posters and dictators sitting next to him in the White House to celebrate his weapons sales on behalf of U.S. weapons companies. Who comes in, depending which words you read. I mean, he's like the Bible. He says everything and its opposite, pick and choose. But he comes in suggesting he might reduce military spending, instead increases it the typical amount, just like the guy before him, just like the guy after him. This is supposed to be your anti-establishment rebel candidate, right? He's going to tell you all the secrets about the Kennedy assassination. And then the CIA says, no, and he salutes and doesn't. Right? Just the generals tell him not to end the war in Afghanistan. He says, okay, I'll keep it going. Right? He's the craziest creature in the swamp, but he's not outside the swamp. So this is a guy who says that what's needed in the genocide in Gaza is more of it. Finish the job. This is a guy whose sophisticated approach to diplomacy is kill their families, right? So obviously you can't compare him terribly badly to any other candidate or major party, as they call it, candidate or past U.S. president, because they're just about all horrendously awful. But to but to call him a peace candidate, this is a guy who tried to do Soviet-style weapons parades down Constitution Avenue in Washington, D.C., and not everybody would let him, but this is a guy who didn't just threaten to use nuclear weapons behind closed doors, did it publicly. This is a guy who backed the use of military force and coups around the world. Did the opposite of diplomacy and cooperation with the world. Called leaders and other countries horrible names, but who also tried for a coup in Washington, D.C., which was a new twist. So, yeah, I mean, if war happened in a vacuum, that'd be one thing. But this guy's whole shtick is bigotry and hatred, right? The whole thing is hating women and Puerto Ricans and people with handicaps and people with brains and, every flavor of people. He hates them. Well, this is what gives you war. I'm going to attack my enemies with the police and the military. I'm going to deport everybody. I'm going to get capital punishment up and rolling. I mean, this, acceptance of violence, this, praise for, Nazi rioters here in my hometown of Charlottesville. This is what makes war acceptable, just as war helps make bigotry acceptable. So, I mean, I'm sure if I think hard enough, I could say something good about the guy, but it's not peace candidate. That ain't it.
Michael, your response.
So one of the ironies is that in 2016, I was one of the people who was making an argument that there were certain less interventionist instincts that were discernible in Trump. Trump was unusual in that, unlike any prior president or would-be president, he had no military experience and he had no experience in public office. So he had no record to evaluate. So we were left to really do speculation and to try to discern trends or patterns in his garbled speech that could be all over the map. It is true that in one of the Republican primary debates, maybe the most astonishing moment of that entire campaign, Donald Trump, you might recall, in South Carolina, right before the primary, castigated Jeb Bush and George W. Bush for lying the country into the Iraq War. Almost unheard of for a major Republican figure to say such things. And
And sorry to interrupt, but he not only said that, but he also castigated Bush's failure to actually keep the country safe on 9/11, saying and basically saying what Michael Moore had been saying for 4 years during the Bush administration, that he didn't keep us safe on 9/11, and it was the only time that he was unanimously booed amongst a very hard right Republican audience.
Right. He was spouting rhetoric that was reminiscent of Michael Moore, literally, and would have been denounced by Republican media organs as loony left-wing anti-Americanism. So that was a genuine shift. He did, partially oppose the Iraq War or inchoately oppose the Iraq War just as a celebrity and a reality TV star, at least by 2004. So at least when you contrast that with the prevailing Republican consensus at the time, it was a stark departure. And when contrasted with Hillary Clinton, one of the most ardently interventionist political figures in the United States, who was unrepentant about her Iraq war vote for over a decade, until finally in 2014, one of her consultants, I guess, said that it might be politically prudent for her to begrudgingly acknowledge that that vote was a mistake, after she had already run for president once before, stalwartly defending that vote against Barack Obama, if you recall, in 2008. And as Secretary of State, was one of the most staunch proponents of the Libya intervention in 2011, of taking a more hard line against Syria and trying to facilitate some degree of regime change. She was a proponent of the escalation in Afghanistan when other administration officials in the Obama administration were more wary, like at the time Joe Biden. So it was a politically astute contrast for Trump to attempt to amplify, because a lot of the public was then and is now, I think, kind of intuitively skeptical of endless U.S. military interventionism. And, I was in Asheville, North Carolina myself recently, talking to some victims of the hurricane disaster. And just when I would probe people just casually for their political views, I would hear on occasion, look, our government is perfectly happy to send money overseas, whether it's to Ukraine or Israel, while ordinary Americans are suffering after a natural disaster. That's a very intuitive and I think perfectly reasonable and justified intuition for ordinary voters to have. And Trump clearly identified that as a political point that he could emphasize in 2016. Now, at the time in 2016, I was not saying that Trump was a peace candidate because, again, he was all over the map. He was saying he was going to bomb the shit, excuse my language, out of ISIS, which he proceeded to do. He, was just not a reliable narrator of his own policy positions, in large part because he had no record for anybody to evaluate and compare and contrast with the rhetoric. But now we're in an entirely different situation. I am always flabbergasted that so many people out there seem like they're stuck in a 2016 time warp. But now we have the merciful advantage of 4 years worth of data from when Trump did wield power to examine and to contrast it and compare it with his current campaign rhetoric.
Yeah.
This is not some brilliant insight on my part. It seems like blindingly obvious of an analytical method to scrutinize politicians, but it's lost on so many people that it never ceases to amaze me. And what did Trump actually do when he was in office? Well, it's all out there in the public record for people to examine, notwithstanding people like David Frum and other so-called never Trump Republicans at the time bloviating about how Trump was going to demolish NATO and disband the rules-based international order, so to say. Trump actually expanded NATO twice. He expanded NATO infrastructure into Ukraine. And if you look at Vladimir Putin's speech on the eve of the Ukraine invasion in February 2022, he lists a series of grievances with U.S. foreign policy, a large percentage of which occurred under Trump, whom the hysterical liberals have been telling us was actually a stooge of Putin or had collusively conspired with him to get into power. I was always a critic of that narrative, in part because it incentivized a certain hawkishness or interventionism within the U.S. political system. So Trump would always be in a political situation where, in order to disprove that he actually was in this illicit relationship with Putin, he would have to take aggressive action abroad. And he did so over and over and over again, whether it was bombing Syria twice, meaning bombing Assad's installations twice in 2017 and 2018, whether it was trying to engineer regime change in Venezuela, which is Russia's chief ally in the Western Hemisphere. That was another Bolton-Pompeo project. I mean, people try to even now claim that Trump is going to bring in this new roster of people who are going to join up with him Avengers style and combat and dismantle the so-called deep state. Whereas just a few days ago, Trump repeated that Mike Pompeo, one of the few top administration officials that Trump did not have a petulant falling out with the first time around, that Pompeo is at the top of his list in terms of who he's going to bring back into a senior administration position, along with people like Tom Cotton, one of the most fanatical interventionists in the entire Senate. I've interviewed Tom Cotton. in his capacity as a Trump campaign surrogate at the presidential debates this year. But, you know, if you look at the McMAGA fantasy version of Trump online, you would think that Tom Cotton is just, I don't know, non-existent. It's very bizarre. Also, people like Mike Waltz, one of the most hardcore interventionist in the House. He's being floated as a top administration official. So there's so much to go through in Trump's actual policy record. One of the refrains that you hear is that Trump didn't start any new wars. Okay, let's even concede that that's true. I think there are ways to quibble with that formulation. Let's even just stipulate that it's true. Let's just give him. Let's just for the sake of argument, stipulate that's true. Okay, so what did he do? You notice that the argument for Trump is like a negative argument, what he refrained allegedly from doing, not what he actually did. How about implementing this so-called
moving the American
well, right, I mean,
to Jerusalem?
The issue with Israel is the most galling.
Like Iranian generals, ripping up the Iran nuclear deal, supporting trying to sabotage. Well, actually trying to do a color revolution in Hong Kong and so forth, and supporting separatist movements there. And Trump has made no bones. He de facto does support a pivot to Asia and actual. Hopefully not a hot war with China, but yeah, and of course, like, his whole thing about Syria is that, like, yeah, we should be joining forces with the Russians to eliminate ISIS, but then afterwards I'm going to finish, the job, and we should just steal Syria's oil and let Turkey balkanize Syria, and while also supporting Kurdish ethno-nationalists in Syria.
Yeah, so I mean, we could go through the entire. I don't want to occupy too much time here in my introductory remarks. Let's give you two examples that I think are very illustrative. So, Trump claimed, again, in a contradictory and less than coherent way, he indicated that he would like potentially to withdraw from Afghanistan. And he did run up to opposition within the military bureaucracy to some degree and within Congress. One of the opponents of withdrawing from Afghanistan in Congress was Liz Cheney, who, it should be said, Kamala Harris is now parading around with, suggesting that they have perfectly compatible worldviews. So nobody should extrapolate from any of my points about Trump here that I'm making an argument for Kamala Harris at all. In fact, the polar opposite. It seems like there's much more confusion out there, at least in my typical circles, about the Trump record. People are fairly well acquainted, I think, with Kamala Harris's duplicity and emptiness. But Liz Cheney was one of those staunch opponents of withdrawing from Afghanistan. I'm working on a piece right as we speak, actually, on this. She introduced an amendment to the 2021. This was in spring of 2020. She introduced an amendment to the upcoming 2021 National Defense Authorization Act to impede bureaucratically Trump's ability to potentially withdraw from Afghanistan by requiring that if the administration reduced troop levels in Afghanistan below a certain benchmark, they would have to submit certain certifications to Congress about how this withdrawal would not imperil counterterrorism operations and wouldn't pose a risk to U.S. assets in the region and so forth. It was an attempt to bureaucratically kind of hamstring Trump. And she got bipartisan support for that, Liz Cheney did, among Democrats who decided that they also were against withdrawing from Afghanistan at the time. So Liz Cheney, one of her stipulations was if the troop levels go below 4,000, this was in the ultimate amendment that she got added to the NDAA, then these constraints would kick in. Lo and behold, Trump never actually withdrew from Afghanistan. Biden did. I'm not saying that Biden is some pure-hearted anti-war person either, but it is true that he withdrew from Afghanistan. But as the partisan reaction to the Biden withdrawal from Afghanistan bill, Trump adopted a new line. Trump is now running around saying over and over again that he was never going to withdraw from Afghanistan at all. In fact, the deal with the Taliban that he and Pompeo brokered, which I was sympathetic to at the time, because you need some kind of direct diplomacy with the reviled Taliban in order to bring about some sort of arrangement to withdraw U.S. forces from a 20-year occupation. And in fact, Kamala Harris is also denouncing Trump for engaging with the Taliban. So she's not just parading around with Liz Cheney. She's resurrecting Bush Cheney slogans like "We'll never negotiate with terrorists." But Trump is now saying that he was never going to withdraw from Afghanistan at all. He's not just objecting to the manner in which the withdrawal was executed, which was a common talking point back in 2021 when the withdrawal took place, but that Trump was going to keep 4,000 U.S. troops permanently occupying Afghanistan at Bagram Air Base, which also would have entailed various supplementary combat operations because the Taliban rejected wholly any continued U.S. presence in Afghanistan. And part of one of the stipulations in the so-called Doha Agreement that Trump and Pompeo brokered with the Taliban was the removal of all, direct quote, all U.S. forces from Afghanistan and from all U.S. bases. Trump now says he was going to renege on that and keep her permanent occupation force in Afghanistan. In part, he says, to antagonize China because he claims that the Bagram Air Base is in proximity to part of China's nuclear arsenal. So that's part of the rationalization. So as much as Liz Cheney and Donald Trump are now in a big feud, along with Liz Cheney's father, Dick, they actually had major policy convergence when Trump was actually in power. And the Afghanistan thing was an example of when they actually did depart on something substantive in terms of policy. But even that now has been cast by the wayside. And Liz Cheney was always cheering for Trump's actions on Iran, Israel, obviously, and other policy areas. And just to conclude, I think one of the incredible propaganda tactics that's been employed in this election and that has convinced a lot of people that Trump is a, quote, peace candidate, or whatever synonym you want to use for that designation, it comes down to Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. has pioneered one of the most brazen methods of propaganda that I've ever seen. And it hardly ever gets critiqued within alternative media, of which I consider myself somewhat of a part. I also have always contributed to mainstream publications, but I have like a foot in both worlds, right? And in alternative media, they're just totally in the tank for this Robert F. Kennedy Jr. mythology. He spoke at Trump's Madison Square Garden rally on Sunday, invoked the legacy of his uncle and father, and is just convincing people of a totally fanciful version of history where John F. Kennedy did not escalate radically in Vietnam, but actually wanted to withdraw and then was thwarted by the assassin's bullet. And he's trying to use this quasi-history to imbue Trump with certain anti-establishment legitimation. RFK Jr. and Trump are perfectly in accord over their shared pro-Israel fanaticism. Maybe that's part of what drew them together. But, there's this amazing confluence of propaganda that RFK Jr. really helped spawn over what I think was his demonstrably fraudulent so-called independent candidacy that actually undercut the independent parties whose nomination he sought. I wrote about this last week for president. He has basically neutered any independent or third party movement, despite claiming for months and soliciting contributions from donors on the premise that he was going to combat the two-party duopoly. Now he's subsumed all of his political support and campaign resources into one wing of the two-party duopoly that he previously maligned by claiming that Trump is actually some kind of peace candidate. That's what Robert F. Kennedy Jr. says. He says, this is basically a direct quote. He says, "Don't you want a president who's going to bring peace to the world?" As Trump is literally calling for Israel to bomb Iranian nuclear facilities and having phone calls with Benjamin Netanyahu congratulating him on invading Lebanon. I mean, I've seldom seen such absurd propaganda, which is why it's necessary to have conversations like this, because so much of the discussion around Trump, for as long as he's now been a political figure in everybody's lives 24/7, it seems, there's still so much confusion and misdirection that it's actually astonishing.
In fact, we're going to. I want to return to RFK Jr. So, David, I have to then ask you this question: You're on mute, by the way, David. And so I have to ask then this second official question to both you and Michael, which is, why are so many left-leaning folk and anti-imperialist libertarians and anti-imperialist leftists keep saying themselves, and they seriously believe this nonsense, that Donald Trump is a peacenik? He wants to do some good, but is forced to do a lot of bad. And again, during his 4 years in office, remind our audience again why Trump from the outside may seem like he's against, the deep state, and people credit his opposition to the Iraq war, but again, he is no peacenik. So, David, your response followed by Michael.
I can't speak for any believer in that, but I think there's got to be a lot of wishful thinking and a lot of winner-take-all electoral, quote-unquote, thinking, in which you demonstrate that one candidate is a war hawk, you prove that the other one is a peacenik. Which of course you could do either way in most U.S. elections because they're both war hawks. I don't know otherwise. I think you were talking about, Republicans getting booed in South Carolina. I remember years further back when there was a presidential debate and a candidate named Ron Paul said, maybe for U.S. foreign policy, we should try something called the Golden Rule, see what other countries would like to be treated, and he got booed. They booed Jesus F. Christ in a Republican presidential debate because that's not what those people wanted. And that's the last. Donald Trump would be far more likely to say, do unto others before they can do unto you, screw them good. This is who he is. He's a candidate of hatred and xenophobia and bigotry. And to say that that's peace because Kamala Harris is a neocon warmonger, that's not a logical argument. It's absolute nonsense. And of course,
Mr. Anti-deep state, I'm against neoconservatives, appointed John Bolton like the moment he got into office.
I mean, they all answer to the deep state to more or less the same degree. They all claim to be anti-establishment to more or less the same degree, and it's kind of extra absurd with an extremely wealthy con artist who's lived off the establishment and corrupt systems and cheated and stolen his entire life to say, I'm here to take on the establishment, when he was just president a few years ago. But the people whose lives are going badly and don't have good prospects for the future and don't like their jobs and don't know how they're ever going to retire, to say, well, we should stop sending money to Ukraine and send it to North Carolina. Well, Donald Trump is not going to send any money to North Carolina. Ron Paul is not going to send any money. None of these people are going to send any money to North Carolina, probably not Biden or Harris either, right? And the money that's going to Ukraine is not going to benefit the people of Ukraine. It's going to get them killed and destroy their country, right? And so we really need a shift from spending money on evil things to spending money on useful things, much more than we need a shift in terms of the location of spending the money. But a lot of Donald Trump is Mr. Peace, I think, comes from this myth that Michael mentioned, that he's anti-NATO, right? When Trump got NATO members to increase their military spending much more than Biden did. And Biden had the benefit of a war going on with a Russian invasion of Ukraine. I should say a drastically escalated war going on.
Which his administration was the architect of which he is a war profiteer on all things Ukraine.
I mean, we could do hours on the evils in Ukraine of both of these clowns. Again, Donald Trump was the one who said, no, let's send weapons to Ukraine, that moved NATO into Ukraine, that lined up Ukraine for NATO membership. And Biden has his, family corruption in Ukraine and has been gung-ho for war in Ukraine. But Donald Trump saying, increase your war spending, take some more money out of your schools and hospitals and put it in weapons, God damn it. Or I hope Russia attacks you. that actually worked better than Biden, put some more money in NATO or I'll forget your name and call you Putin. And like that didn't have the same impact as Trump's bit of nonsense. It just, to say that's an enemy of NATO when he does more to build up NATO than the other guy, and not only bombed Syria, but bombed Russians in Syria, evicted Russian diplomats, tore up treaties with Russia, threatened Russia, opposed Russian oil deals, opposed any cooperation with Russia on anything while being called Putin's slave. So I just think the important thing here is that if Trump wins, the lesson learned should not be that Kamala Harris didn't go crazy right-wing enough. The lesson learned should be she should have opposed a genocide that was all over the news, that had a majority of the country demanding she oppose it, and she refused. That should be the lesson. But I'm not saying people should go out and do that. I think elections are dramatically less important than 18 other things we should be talking about. But if you're going to bother with this election, vote for her, not Trump. I mean, hold your nose hard either way. But to take this fascist buffoon who, pretends to work at McDonald's when he couldn't get a job at McDonald's because of his felony record, and make him president, it just makes the whole country a laughingstock. I mean, that is just the worst choice you can make.
Michael, instead of responding to that, let's continue with what you were saying about RFK Jr., because I actually had questions prepared about RFK Jr. and the historical arguments that you bravely on Twitter/X were pushing back against.
Can we table that for a moment, because there is a point that I wanted to make.
Sure.
About in response to the question that you posed to David, because I think it's important.
Okay.
You asked, why is it that certain people, maybe of a vaguely left-wing disposition, still have this belief that Trump is a superior alternative or would represent the best chance for quote-unquote peace, however they might phrase it.
Yeah.
I do think that a lot of the responsibility here has to be on the Democrats.
Okay.
Joe Biden's foreign policy has been a nightmare by and large. Ukraine at one point became such a nuclear risk that the CIA was estimating, and Biden himself said, that as of approximately October 22, I don't know what the current estimate is, but as of October 22, the world faced the greatest risk of nuclear annihilation since the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Yeah.
And that's a direct byproduct of this totally obstinate policy of just endlessly funneling weapons into Ukraine, intelligent so-called sharing, whereby the U.S. is essentially a co-combatant against Russia, gradually authorizing higher and higher grade weaponry to be deployed to Ukraine, and loosening the restrictions that had initially circumscribed the nature of that U.S. intervention, where Biden has now given license to Ukraine to do long-range strikes inside Russia using U.S. weaponry. And then on the issue of the Middle East, I mean, do I even need to say anything? The Biden-Harris administration has supplied more armaments to Israel for use in its pulverization campaign than any U.S. administration ever. So it's hard to blame people that look at the current policy status quo, look at the bizarre palace coup that the Democrats effectuated to replace Biden with Harris, but have that replacement be accompanied by no substantive policy shift as far as anybody can discern, except, according to Kamala Harris, the one difference that there might be between her presidency, prospectively, and a Biden presidency is that she will include a Republican in her cabinet. And Liz Cheney seems like she's in the, at the top of the list in terms of one of the Republicans that Kamala says she would pick, maybe for Secretary of State. So I certainly can't encourage anybody to vote for Kamala Harris, even in a sort of so-called lesser of two evils calculus. I've already voted myself in here in New Jersey, and I just wrote in a cartoon character. People think it's a wasted vote, but I don't know. To me,
how the Green Party with 5% or the PSL with the 5%, but that's another story.
I mean, we could get into a Green Party digression. I don't find the Green Party or the Libertarian Party particularly credible, but people, we don't have to necessarily have that debate right now. And I mean, look, I viewed my vote as an abstention more than anything else, and because there's no way that I could ratify the Biden-Harris administration's policy record, nor could I ratify the re-empowerment of Donald Trump. So I know people have different calculations for how they formulate their voting preferences, but for me, that was my preference. And in terms of like why people, but then there's another aspect here, which is the enormous cult of personality around Donald Trump. Kamala Harris and Joe Biden don't really have cults of personality, if you notice. Maybe arguably Obama did to a certain extent, but
Obama
at least in the past he did. But Joe Biden and Kamala Harris don't really. And I think Trump's cult of personality even exceeds that of Obama's in certain ways, just given the different sort of compositions of the party coalitions.
Well, he is a real life sociopathic joker, like the one Heath Ledger played in in that Batman movie. And I guess because he is a bit of like a right-wing shock jock stand-up comedian who you can sometimes laugh with, like when he mocks John Kasich and the way he eats and says like he always tells his kids small little bites. I mean, I guess that's why a lot of people like
he's a consummate entertainer. He was one of the most popular corporate media entertainers in the country, maybe the most popular in terms of reality TV shows. So I've never bought into this sort of like neurotic liberal critique of Trump where you can't even acknowledge that the guy is amusing. I still laugh at his wisecracks. Actually, that's part of his genius. That's why he has this awesome cult of personality and why he has such a historically unprecedented grip on the Republican Party. He picks and chooses Republican primary winners in Congress with one Truth Social post. There was one Republican Congressman, Bob Good of Virginia, who endorsed initially Ron DeSantis in the 2016 primary, but then once it was clear that Trump was going to win, which was clear all along, so Bob Good was sort of foolish to even do that, Bob Good did everything in his power to sycophantically kowtow to Trump, including going to the Manhattan courthouse when Trump was on trial for the so-called hush money payment, and to show his solidarity with Trump, but it wasn't good enough for Trump. Trump endorsed his opponent in the Republican primary, and Bob Good lost. He's going to be out of Congress. It's very unusual for incumbents to lose congressional races, but Trump can facilitate that. So you could see how he's such a force of gravitational pull within the Republican coalition. And right-wing media, or even kind of more hazily ideological media, like a lot of the podcasts that Trump now appears on, they have a bit of a right-wing valence, maybe out of revulsion to the Democrats, but for whatever reason, they just don't critique him.
Sort of, libertarianism.
Yeah, so that they don't critique him. So here's a hugely nagging example of this from my perspective, because when the enormous national security supplemental bill was being deliberated earlier this year, March, April, it passed in April. Trump, I reported this at the time. I wrote it up. People can go look if they want. But Trump provided critical political backing to Mike Johnson, Speaker of the House, to usher through $100 billion national security supplemental for Israel, Ukraine, and the so-called Indo-Pacific, in addition to a smattering of other legislative items like banning TikTok. I mean, Harris and Trump are both on TikTok now, even though they both literally supported banning it. I mean, explain that one to me. Because it was supposedly a tool of Chinese espionage. But I couldn't get anybody within the Trump circles or even the Trump adjacent circles to care in the slightest that Trump was politically decisive in enabling the Republican House of Representatives and Senate, over whom Trump has extraordinary power, to usher through the largest ever disbursement of U.S. funding for Ukraine, $61 billion. That was Trump. I said, only somewhat facetiously, that any of the long-range munitions that are being fired over the border into Russia should be emblazoned with both the gold lettering of Donald J. Trump and Joe Biden, because they were both part and parcel of that getting enacted. And so there is this extremely palpable devotion to Trump as a person that I think makes it very difficult to get through to people. Again, even if they're not diehard right-wingers, even if they might have some more left-leaning, you might say, tendencies, it makes it incredibly hard to penetrate to them with facts and examples of Trump's actual record, in part because they're kind of polarizing against what often genuinely was incredibly histrionic and inaccurate media criticism of Trump, the whole Russiagate saga, the dual impeachments, both of which I think were fallaciously predicated. I don't say this as a Trump defender. I say this is someone who tries to be an impartial evaluator. And the prosecutions of Trump, all of which I would also argue have been incredibly fallacious. So
have only made him more popular amongst his cult followers.
Right. So people are polarizing against that. And when they see a liberal critique of Trump that is the most dominant out there, which is that he's a fascist, Nazi,
Putin
puppet, exactly, that he's going to collapse the rules-based international order, that January 6th was the most important event in human history because a bunch of yahoos temporarily disrupted a legislative proceeding. People are walled off to receiving rational critiques of Trump, which I've tried to provide, but it's a difficult task, I have to say.
So, David, David.
I just think that's a combination of actually rational critique with utter falsehood, like Russiagate, with exaggeration. A day when Trump did something horrible was the worst day in the history of the world, and therefore it wasn't horrible at all. I just think that this power, this cult of personality, this dominance of people with the whim of a single buffoon is a very strong reason to oppose a guy. And is a very similar phenomenon to fascist leaders and Nazi leaders. And this is why people pull out those words, because he has this cult of personality, and he's mean and nasty and racist and bigoted and militarist, and wants to use the courts and the police and the military against his enemies, and there are enemies within the government, and he's going to get you. And if these aren't tendencies of a fascist leader, I don't know what are. And the fact that people made up a pile of horse manure about Russia and impeached him for all the wrong reasons, because the Democrats aren't going to impeach him for anything Democrats do. They have to find something that distinguishes him from them and then impeach him for that, when there were 24 much more significant reasons that he ought to have been impeached, as there have been with every other president. I don't know, but I think I just think this 20 seconds that you take to fill in a little oval with your pen is just way overblown. We ought to be working on surrounding the United States Capitol until the weapons stop moving. We ought to be working on building campaigns to have actual elections with actually decent candidates, which means getting out the legal bribery, getting out the corporate media control, getting out the gerrymandering and the electoral college, and abolishing the United States Senate and all the other reforms that are needed. That nonviolent activism is far more important than which of these horrible, horrible people you vote for. But I think this, this cult of personality thing goes exactly to one of the major reasons, if you're going to vote, and you're going to vote in one of the states that matter, which are not, my state or Michael's state, vote against him. you know.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And that's a perfect segue. I want to return to what Michael was talking about when it comes to RFK Jr. Speaking of other grifters, what is so David, you respond first. What is your assessment that RFK Jr. was some kind of a peacenik, and why did so many left-leaning folks who devote their time to mobilize against imperialism foolishly thought RFK Jr. was a peacenik? And I include Dennis Kucinich, who I think was the best president we never had, and yet he propped him up. So, David, your response, followed by Michael's response.
Dennis is a unique case in some ways, but part of a trend in others. And him hanging out with RFK Jr. and Tucker Carlson and a rather different crowd than he used to hang out with is disturbing to many of his past supporters. Certainly, I had lots of people tell me, at least months ago, that Kennedy was a peace candidate. But when you showed them some of his speeches and some of his proposals and how he had managed to be worse on Israel than just about any of the other war candidates, at least some of them, in my experience, would drop it and say, "Oh my God, I didn't know, I'm sorry." So there wasn't quite that same aura of, well, you just don't understand because Donald Trump is beyond you. You know, it was on a more human, fallible scale where you could say, actually, this guy is horrendous, and people would, you know, believe the facts about him, at least in my experience. But you know, why?
But that being said, RFK Jr. Now, I mean, but just on his socio-economic policies, he was no Dennis Kucinich, he was no Ralph Nader, and he certainly was no Bernie Sanders. Which is why I was flabbergasted that many left-leaning folks propped him up. But I do not want to reopen the old
people are desperate.
COVID, but I think yeah, I think that kind of explains a lot.
They're desperate for challengers. They're desperate for angry opponents of the rotten system, and you can't blame them because it's a rotten system and they're angry. But
that's why we have, that's why we have the Green Party, Party for Socialism and Liberation, and Socialist Equality Party. Hashtag just say it.
The fact that you saw a huge number of people support Bernie Sanders and then support Donald Trump tells you that for a lot of these people, it just doesn't make a damn bit of difference who the candidate is or what they're for, as long as they're not some other candidate or not some other pair of candidates, or they're coming from outside the system, or selective reading can give you a certain tone from some of their comments that at least they're pissed off, you know. And Robert F. Kennedy seemed, in his, you know, scratchy voice way, to be sort of pissed off a lot of the time. And that's, you know, that's all people are asking for, you know, is to stop saying everything's okay and start saying everything's going to hell and I'm going to fix it. Even if you're going to fix it by deporting immigrants, what the hell is that going to fix? Nothing. But they're going to fix it with some easy way, you know, that
and herd immunity. That herd immunity, not wearing a hospital mask. Michael, yours. Yeah. Your response.
Well, I have to still like Dennis Kucinich.
Me too. Me too. I still do.
Yeah, and one of the difficulties for me over the course of this whole RFK Jr. boondoggle is that part of me was inclined to give it at least some benefit of the doubt, given Kucinich's involvement, because Kucinich is one of the rare people in American politics who I do think is principled, who does not just shapeshift on command in pursuit of power necessarily. I'm not saying he's a perfect specimen, but he was a rare exception, at least to my mind. And Kucinich would also do right. I mean, again, Kucinich was also well known to engage in bipartisan cooperation with people like Ron Paul, who David mentioned earlier, on issues where they converged. Kucinich was actually I think he still is a member of the board of the Ron Paul Institute, and they collaborated when they were both in Congress on,
ending the
items
drug
that you have to
war,
be
ending imperialism, and so forth.
correct.
Like
Correct.
that. And that's the good that's the good kind of left-right coalition I like.
Exactly.
I don't like the left-right coalition where I'm going to go on Fox News, talk anti-war stuff, and then later engage in transphobia and complain about wokeism and stuff like that.
Right. And I think that's largely the type of left-right convergence that
Sadly has been developed.
Kucinich sought to fertilize. And yet, I couldn't get past what seemed like the glaring deceit of the RFK Jr. enterprise. Like when he was nominally first running in the Democratic primaries, obviously it seemed perfectly legitimate for Joe Biden to have a primary challenger, even as the incumbent president. I was not against that at all. But I would just be swamped when I would say even the most lightly critical thing about RFK Jr. with people who were also in their version of a personality cult. Maybe they liked him because they thought that he was against COVID policies. I'm not one to be fixated on the vaccine necessarily, but I did cover what I thought were legitimate infringements on civil liberties over the
Okay.
course
Wait,
of COVID.
actually, hold that thought, Michael. David, no problem. David unfortunately has to go, but David,
Okay.
I'll be in touch with you again. And again, thank you for coming on the program. And I hope I don't get you in trouble for talking about the U.S. election race.
You talk about whatever you want. Thanks, my pleasure. Good talking with you guys.
All right, take care.
So continue with what you were saying, Michael.
Yeah, so I covered what I thought were legitimate infringements on civil liberties under the auspices of COVID policy. So that's a legitimate area of scrutiny, I always thought. But there were certain people who coalesced around RFK Jr. on those grounds, and it didn't really lend itself to a larger political project, even despite the prominence that it gave him as some sort of anti-establishment bomb thrower. And I'm also a stickler for the historical record, and for RFK Jr.'s prominence to be so disproportionately predicated on his claim to be carrying the mantle of the Kennedy dynasty, and he recasts the history of the Kennedys in this hallowed light, which used to be something that mainstream liberals predominantly did because they wanted to amp up this mythology around so-called Camelot, and that John F. Kennedy and Robert F. Kennedy Sr. were these martyrs against the military-industrial complex and so forth. That whole tendency of historical analysis was increasingly being appropriated by Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and embraced by other ideological elements. A lot of right-leaning people who in the past probably would have ridiculed the Kennedys and the mystique around them, and threw barbs at like Ted Kennedy for Chappaquiddick and so forth. They were now adopting this whole myth around the Kennedy legacy and using that as a vessel to imbue Trump with mythological traits. And Robert F. Kennedy Jr. predicated his candidacy on this. I mean, it's not, would anybody have heard of him if not for his surname or his initials? I tend to doubt it. I know he had a career as an environmental lawyer, but there are a lot of environmental lawyers out there who couldn't have galvanized a national political movement or quote unquote movement. And it is true that, and I did a long piece on this, people can look up if they want, from like 10 days ago at mtracy.net. Sorry for the plug. But but RFK Jr. in this election cycle was polling as potentially the most formidable third party or independent presidential candidate since Ross Perot in 1992. And people may forget, or maybe they never knew, that Ross Perot at various points in 1992 could have potentially defeated both Bill Clinton and George H.W. Bush outright. So this was a notable phenomenon in U.S. politics for there to be a resurgence of a potentially legitimate third-party candidacy or independent candidacy, and it turned out to be a swindle. I'm sorry. But if RFK Jr. was going around saying that he was going to dismantle the two-party duopoly after he withdrew from the Democratic primaries in October of 2023, and that both Trump and Biden, who was then the nominee, presumably, were deathly afraid of him, and that he turns out to just funnel all of his resources and energy into one wing of the so-called duopoly, I don't know what else to call that if not a swindle. And by the way, a lot of the minor state parties whose nomination he sought for president so he could bypass some of the signature gathering requirements and other requirements, they also have told me that they believe that they were swindled. So if a campaign is premised on phony mythology, phony dynastic mythology, and also clearly so insincere that it could just be collapsed and suspended at a moment's notice and then used to bolster one of the two major parties, then I think my intuition of skepticism around it initially was correct. But it was not very popular in online media circles. If there's a comment section to this video, I'm sure a lot of the comments will be die-hard pro RFK Jr. That's certainly an interesting phenomenon. I don't know exactly how to diagnose that, except that people are kind of desperate for anything that they could see as anti-establishment, even if they don't define what anti-establishment really means. I mean, RFK Jr. spent his entire adult life as a partisan Democrat who, I like to joke, and it's not too much of a joke, it might be accurate, endorsed Hillary Clinton on more consecutive occasions than perhaps even Bill Clinton. He was a loyal foot soldier of the Democratic Party and his family dynasty, and putting out this nonsensical historiography of the Kennedys to endow him as some sort of virtue that I think is just disconnected entirely from the factual record. So people like to, I mean, people who I know and like and respect most of the time were always trying to privately urge me, including Dennis Kucinich and other people in the journalism world, to appreciate what RFK Jr. was bringing to the table. And I always felt it was empty pandering. Yeah, he would occasionally kind of like do a verbal copy and paste of like various anti-Ukraine intervention memes, but it didn't seem to be rooted in any real critique. It seemed to be opportunistic and slightly questionable in its provenance. And then I think a lot of people had a change of heart. So when he first announced his candidacy for the Democratic nomination, April of 2023, I had always been peripherally aware of Robert F. Kennedy Jr., but I had never done a deep research dive, and I did that. And he was a full-blown Russiagator in Trump's first term. He would be denouncing Trump for sidling up to dictators and autocrats, as RFK put it, like Putin and Kim Jong-un and President Xi. He just bought hook, line, and sinker into most conventional histrionic liberal critiques of Trump. And then all of a sudden he has this like dramatic epiphany at age 69, I think it was, and people are supposed to be impressed by that. I'm sorry, but if you can't hold any coherent political beliefs as a nationally prominent figure for any extended period of time, I'm not sure why I'm supposed to find that laudable. In fact, I find it to be an indication that you're kind of just an opportunist and you'll say whatever given the political circumstances. So like back when I was like in the weeds of Russiagate, day in and day out, he had a diametrically opposite view. And yet when he announces his candidacy for president, I'm the one who's, stifling this incredible anti-establishment movement. It never really made sense. And then for him to be propagating this Kennedy family mythology that I just knew to be totally groundless suggested to me that the entire foundation of his candidacy was flawed at best, probably fatally flawed, and it proved out to be so, given his decision to endorse Trump, in part because, I mean, so when Robert F. Kennedy Jr. endorsed Trump, he said that there were several major reasons why he did so. One was the Ukraine war, one was freedom of speech, and one was his various health endeavors, like around the food supply and toxins. That third consideration, I find it hard for anybody really to say that they don't support. I mean, who doesn't want to remove pesticides from the water and the soil and so forth? Totally innocuous.
Except that when Trump was in power and David
Right.
Johnson reported this, Trump, removed any sort of even, minimal common sense, consumer protection or regulation, as our far right friends like to call them.
Right, and Robert F. Kennedy Jr. was denouncing Trump for that, for stuffing his administration with lobbyists from corporate industry. But on the issues of Ukraine and speech, which are more in my ballywick, RFK's reasoning was totally specious. RFK Jr., when he at least seemed ostensibly committed to running an independent candidacy, he was denouncing Trump for bragging about arming Ukraine, for being unrepentant about arming Ukraine, and RFK Jr. even accused Trump of being partially culpable for bringing about the conditions that led to the invasion of Ukraine. So RFK Jr. was blaming Trump for the Ukraine war. I think relatively soundly, right? But then it so happens that RFK Jr. and Trump have these like secret consultations, and RFK Jr. has yet another epiphany. So again, can't hold together any coherent beliefs for any extended period of time, and decides that he and Trump are totally of a piece
spirits
on Ukraine policy. I asked RFK Jr. about this myself at the first Kamala Trump presidential debate in Philadelphia last month, and Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is surrounded by this phalanx of guards and minders and things, and so you could barely get a question in with him. But I did manage to get one truncated and brief question in briefly, and I said, so Trump has never stopped bragging about arming Ukraine. 2 months ago, you were denouncing him for this. What's the deal? And all he could say is that he has these secret discussions with Trump and everything changed. I'm sorry, but if that's the basis for having this grandiose political epiphany, you have to be incredibly credulous to just take that at face value. And now RFK Jr. just going around lying now. He's outright, I don't know if it's an intentional lie, but he's spewing absolute falsehoods. Like just within the past week, I think, he was at some public campaign, Trump campaign event, and said that, look, guys, the second Trump administration is going to be drastically different this time around, and it really should inspire our hope, because Trump's doing something unprecedented, according to RFK Jr. He's not accepting government funding for his transition. So usually the Government Services Administration underwrites presidential transition services, and Trump's not doing that. Instead, he's getting private donors to fund his transmission operation, which conveniently means that the donors don't have to be disclosed. And this is brand new, and it should make everybody so hopeful that he's going to put the right people in power. Unlike in the first administration, I guess it's a very strange way to praise a presidential candidate, by saying, I guess implicitly, his first term was a failure, so we should put him back into power to reward him for the failed first term. But according to RFK Jr., they have this entirely different protocol for the second Trump administration transition, and it's just not true.
But
2016, Trump did this. 2016, Trump did the same thing. He solicited private donations from private donors to months in advance of the 2016 election to start up the operation for a transition. One of those donors was Linda McMahon, who maxed out, and she's now the co-chair of this current transition operation, along with Howard Lutnick, the CEO of Cantor Fitzgerald, who I also interviewed at the vice presidential debate, who confirmed to me that Jared Kushner is intensively involved in assisting him with staffing the next administration, just like Kushner did the first time. So this is just like pure fantasy, but RFK Jr. is a very valuable asset, I think, for Trump in fostering this impression that he has this new dream team alongside him to combat the establishment. And RFK Jr. is just straight up either lying or not interrogating what he's been apparently told enough that he has any compunction about just spewing absolute falsehoods.
But
And I
have
think
to ask-
it's a huge. It's at least Ross Perot was sincere about running a third party candidacy, even though he was going to be accused of being a spoiler, right? Which he was. The George H.W. Bush, orbit still blames Ross Perot for that. He was besieged in 1996 not to run again after he founded the Reform Party, but he did anyway. And Bill Clinton had an even bigger victory over the Republicans. Ralph Nader, he's deprecated to this day. I was at the Democratic Convention in Philadelphia, and you still see like booths demonizing Ralph Nader 24 years later for supposedly spoiling the election for Al Gore in 2000. Or at least third-party candidates in the past have done what they said they were going to do. For RFK Jr., it was just a complete boondoggle.
But I have to ask then this question. So changing subject for a bit. What is your historical assessment from just a purely anti-imperialist position on JFK and his brother, and this idea that they were Cold War liberals, but then after the Cuban Missile Crisis, they saw the light and radically reversed course and were peaceniks, doves, and that's why they were murdered by the CIA. Now, I do think that is the case, that the deep state murdered both, but I simply don't buy anymore into the historical arguments of Oliver Stone, past guest Peter Kuznick, the great Massachusetts Peace Action, and even my own friend, frequent returning champion and guest on this show, Rick Sterling of antiwar.com, Mintpress News, Consortium News, LA Progress, and the Syria Solidarity campaign, have made these arguments. Some argue that the Israeli deep state played a huge part in killing JFK. And again, apart from the late Glen Ford of Black Agenda Report, Margaret Kimberley, the current executive editor of Black Agenda Report, good friends of the show, and Paul Street, historian associated with Counterpunch, all of them are the only people I can think of that call BS that JFK and RFK were peacenik doves and him being a great friend to black people and other marginalized groups. So what's your response on that? And of course, in memory of John Pilger also never bought into the BS that JFK and RFK were peaceniks and doves. So I'm curious your response to that.
How about Seymour Hersh? People should read Seymour Hersh's seminal examination of the Kennedy legacy. It's a book called The Dark Side of Camelot, 1997. I think it's a shame that it's not more well regarded, or it's not as well recognized within Hersh's pantheon of work as it ought to be. I first read it probably over 10 years ago, and it has informed my perspective on this ever since. And people should go. I mean, there are actually lots of people who do push back on this mythology. The irony, though, is that it used to be more that they were pushing back against enamored Camelot worshiping mainstream liberals. Now it's taken on a different ideological valence, where it's a lot of, vaguely right wing or independent Kennedy valorizers who valorize Kennedy as a proxy for Trump. But the arguments are still relatively the same. I find it bizarre that people credit John F. Kennedy for bringing the world closer to nuclear annihilation than ever before, and then lying about how he resolved the conflict over Cuba. One of the amazing insights that Seymour Hersh unearths in his book is that although John F. Kennedy did broker a secret deal to remove missiles from Turkey that were going to be removed anyway and replaced with higher grade missiles, he lied about it contemporaneously. That only came out many years later. And because he had to keep up his appearance of being this arch Cold Warrior who could never buckle to the Soviet Union, especially within the Western Hemisphere. And, even the material that still comes out to this day about the Cuban Missile Crisis heightens the terror around how close the world really was to the ultimate calamity under John F. Kennedy's watch. One of the kind of post hoc rationalizations that is meant to imbue Kennedy with some kind of virtue for that episode is that he ended up not launching a nuclear war. It seems like a low bar to me. I think the policy framework that Kennedy ushered into office that led to the crisis in the first place is a pretty damning indictment of his presidency. If that were the only thing that he did, I think it would be a historic indictment of his presidency. But the reason why, but John F. Kennedy in 1960 ran against Nixon from the quote unquote right, or at least, I kind of don't think that the right left continuum is always perfectly apt here, because there are plenty of people on the putative liberal left who are much more interventionist than people on the putative right, including the Kennedys.
Hence Vietnam and the Korean War.
Correct. But John F. Kennedy ran in 1960 denouncing Richard Nixon and Dwight Eisenhower as being softies on communism, as not being committed enough to the cause of imposing regime change in Cuba. And then when he got into office, he carried out that goal. He's always Kennedy absolvers tried to rationalize the Bay of Pigs invasion in April 1961 as somehow out of JFK's control. It was just something that he kind of meekly inherited and just sort of let go. And it wasn't his fault that it was such a fiasco. But as Hersh meticulously details in his book, John F. Kennedy was hyper involved in the most intricate planning of a regime change invasion operation and bombing mission of Cuba. John F. Kennedy was maniacally obsessed with assassinating Fidel Castro, along with his brother, Robert F. Kennedy Sr., who he installed as Attorney General. Imagine anybody today seeing a president install their own brother.
People literally lost their shit when Trump had Ivanka, as part of his administration, and then the Republicans attacked, Clinton for they attacked Hillary Clinton for having the audacity to not just be like a boring housewife of the White House, and how dare she make a universal healthcare bill, which was actually a carbon copy of our right-wing healthcare bill.
but like it's one thing if a first lady takes on some sort of, unofficial policy role. It's another thing if you appoint your brother to a Senate confirmed position, one of the most powerful in the entire government, Attorney General, and people now look back on that as some like touching tale of fraternal bonding, when it couldn't. It's one of the most brazen examples of nepotism in American history. And Robert F. Kennedy Sr. was just JFK's like political bagman, and assisted JFK in his maniacal pursuit of assassinating Fidel Castro. And that pursuit intensified after the Bay of Pigs invasion, which obviously failed.
But then I have to ask this question.
Yeah.
But then why was the Bay of Pigs? See, this is something I have studied this so many times. I remember having to learn about the Cold War in IB history. I've seen Peter Kuznick and Oliver Stone's great documentaries, and I've seen even great documentaries on the Cold War, which shows, both sides of the arguments, the Soviets and so forth. And I never, ever get a satisfying answer as to, okay, so JFK wanted to overthrow Castro. Why didn't he overthrow Castro? Is that just because Castro was just that good at thwarting
Well, Seymour Hersh gives an answer. This is why people should go read the book. It's been out for almost 2 decades. According to Hersh, part of the invasion plot involved a CIA scheme to assassinate Castro. The CIA scheme failed. With Kennedy's approval was attempt to assassinate Castro by enlisting the mafia, Sam Giancana, the famous Chicago mobster, who the Kennedys were also very intricately involved with. The mob, it seemed, alleged, basically delivered the state of Illinois to Kennedy in the 1960 election through genuine election fraud, not like the 2020 version that Trump complains about.
And Kennedy even had an affair with a mobster's.
Correct. JFK had one of his many sexual romps, which was covered up at the time, and ought to have been reported on by the journalist clique who were Kennedy valorizers in the Georgetown cocktail party set. Was not because of some scintillation over his sexual liaisons. I mean, who cares? It's because they had a huge role. They were indicative of his recklessness as president. I mean, he had compromising rendezvous with the paramour of a mob boss and would actually send information back and forth using her as like a courier to the mob to circumvent oversight, forget from Congress, but even also within the executive branch, because he used the mob through a CIA intermediary to attempt to assassinate Castro just ahead of the Bay and Pigs invasion. The plot failed, so the mob failed to assassinate Castro at the behest of the CIA, and then that screwed up the entire regime change operation. So JFK pulled the plug after authorizing the first round of aerial bombardment of Cuba, because the point was to destabilize all of Cuba to make it ripe for the regime change operation. When they failed to assassinate Castro, that threw everything off course. So, but then JFK and RFK made it one of their, most fanatical goals to assassinate Castro. A great historical irony is that the very day of JFK's own assassination, there was a meeting between a CIA operative working out of the White House. So JFK, he's supposed to be this foe of the CIA. No, he radically empowered the CIA to do his own bidding and ran CIA operations directly out of the White House, bypassing a more customary chain of command. And on the day of the JFK assassination, so November 22nd, 1963, one member of the CIA assassination program was meeting with a would-be assassin and giving a poison pen to the would-be assassin and to try again to assassinate Castro. When Lyndon Johnson took over and he got access to some of these assassination programs, he famously said John F. Kennedy was running a, quote, goddamn murder inc. out of the White House. And Lyndon Johnson actually put a stop to it. So like these fanciful kind of counter historical narratives have it that the CIA assassinated John F. Kennedy because they wanted to install Lyndon Johnson instead to carry forth their agenda. But why would they? So you're saying that they installed Lyndon Johnson to shut down their assassination program and actually limit their power relative to the Kennedys? Lyndon Johnson was actually kind of not in the same cultural milieu of the CIA at the time, which were all these elite university graduates who styled themselves as like intellectuals and thinkers and, grand strategists. Lyndon Johnson was, from, the backwoods of Texas, essentially. So he had less of a cultural affinity with the CIA. And so, and then on the question of Vietnam, again, not only did Kennedy not limit the CIA's powers, he radically empowered the CIA to take on a combat role in Laos and in Vietnam itself. he, people should read, the Chomsky's book, Rethinking Camelot. And you don't have to take Chomsky's word for anything. Like most of what Chomsky writes, it's meticulously cited. I mean, there are endless citations that you can go, as I've done, and check the primary source material, and it's incontrovertible. Kennedy had no secret plan, as far as anybody can reasonably discern, to withdraw from Vietnam, and all of a sudden he gets assassinated, and then the plan is thwarted. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. I mean, I actually hadn't seen this quote until I was doing some research earlier today, but Robert F. Kennedy Sr. was interviewed by the JFK Library's Oral History Project in April of 1964. And he was pressed over and over again by the interviewer, was there ever a thought in the Kennedy administration to withdraw from Vietnam? And Robert F. Kennedy Sr. was adamant, no, no, no. John F. Kennedy was intensely committed to the war effort. And Robert F. Kennedy Jr., up until the war became more politically unpopular around the Tet Offensive, when a lot of people changed their tune and then tried to revise history to cast the Kennedys in a more war-skeptical light, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. was always very explicit. He said that people should not oppose Lyndon Johnson's variant of the war policy because it was a firm continuation of what his brother's war policy was. And he supported that continuation of the war policy. So, I mean, we can't exhaustively go over the entire record here, I don't think. And I know that like my saying this will contradict or aggravate a lot of people who buy into this narrative. Again, a huge irony that these used to be more mainstream liberal types. Now they've taken on a different ideological hue that in service of Trump, bizarrely enough. But
we're gonna have
I think it's true.
We're gonna have to definitely invite you back to a future show to discuss more Kennedy alongside other panelists. But then I have to ask,
and I should say, I do think Oliver Stone's mythological version of this that he put on film, I haven't seen the movie in a while. I remember finding it entertaining, but it was fairly integral in putting forth a martyr myth around JFK, where like one of the climactic orations in the movie, and I did find the script relatively recently, Alexander Coburn wrote about this at the time in The Nation, basically chastising the people who were flooding his inbox at the time with the email, with letters and so forth, trying to elevate the Kennedy myth. Alexander Coburn quotes an excerpt from the stirring climactic oration in that movie, where the prosecutor Jim Garrison says, he didn't actually say this, it was like kind of it was like dramatic license from Stone, that when John F. Kennedy was killed, the nation's innocence was taken, and the nation lost the father figure. So talk about quote unquote fascism. I mean, if you want to use that terminology, the kind of reverence with which JFK is venerated in the form of that movie, it does take on creepy fascistic overtones, elevating him as like the father of the nation who was taken away from us, and now we have to avenge his legacy or something. And again, none of this would all be of interest to me as a historical aside, regardless. But it's taken on a very peculiar resonance now because it's being marshaled in service of bolstering the current campaign propaganda of Donald Trump. As bizarre as that is to say, it's true in the personage of RFK Jr., who, like I said, was just at the Madison Square Garden rally that Trump held, and I'm sure is going to be running around the country very assiduously for the next week, repeating the same nonsense.
Very briefly, I have to ask you this. Tulsi Gabbard.
Yeah.
She was once the darling of the anti-imperialist movement, particularly folks who want détente with Russia and are against NATO, want friendly relations with China, mobilizing against the pivot to Asia. She was, without a doubt, a great friend to the Syrian faction, to the Syrian anti-war, anti-imperialist movement. And while I don't mind...
She visited Syria with Dennis Kucinich.
Exactly.
fact-finding mission.
Exactly. And while I don't mind leftists or left-leaning folk going on far-right publications or any kind of platform to present their views and make a case and try to even convert people to, economic leftism and social liberalism and tolerance, she has gone full batshit with her attacks on the on her former center-right party as being too woke, anti-white, anti-police, and is now clearly a regressive on everything, especially Palestine. She saw the aloha of Biden, and she now sees it in Pumpkinhead. So, Michael, briefly on this one before I get to the last question, what the hell is wrong with Tulsi Gabbard?
Well, I covered Tulsi Gabbard's 2020 Democratic primary campaign very closely because she was being, I think, wrongly maligned by much of the media as a Russian agent, as somebody who kowtows to dictators, the same slew of smears that occasionally Trump is also subjected to, pretenses. But the difference with Tulsi Gabbard is that she actually had a record of, I think, some degree of courage through her tenure in Congress and her dealings within the Democratic Party, such as when she famously resigned from the DNC as a vice chair in 2016 to endorse Bernie Sanders on the ground that Bernie Sanders had much superior foreign policy views, however, kind of half-formed. I never thought that Bernie Sanders was even that particularly interested in foreign policy, at least not something that he emphasizes. But in contrast with Hillary Clinton, Tulsi thought that it was incumbent upon her to, relinquish her title that kind of compelled a certain degree of neutrality within the Democratic Party's primaries and support Bernie Sanders. And she ultimately was selected to put his name into nomination at the Democratic Convention, which is like a ceremonial role that's given to somebody who is of high esteem within the campaign. And yeah, she did buck orthodoxy around issues like Syria, around issues like Russiagate, when virtually the entire Democratic Party was captured by this genuine security state conspiracy theory that never had any real basis, and they would be lining up behind the securities behind the intelligence services, the FBI, the CIA, the NSA, to do whatever they could, according to them, to undercut Trump, even if then empowering and legitimizing these so-called deep state factions. She supported WikiLeaks and Julian Assange, and she had a critique of Trump, which was unique. She didn't fall into the typical MSNBC style hysterics where you're just kind of shrieking about Putin and all the other cliches constantly.
Syndrome,
It was a substantive critique of Trump's actual record. So Tulsi Gabbard accused Trump of plundering Syria by maintaining a U.S. occupation presence in Syria to steal Syria's natural resources. She was one of the very first people who came out and denounced the assassination of Soleimani, and accused Trump of initiating a state of war, that's a direct quote, with Iran, and bring the U.S. to the brink of a full-out war with Iran. She was a huge advocate within the Democratic Party, which was a minoritarian position at the time, for withdrawing from Afghanistan, for détente with Russia, for the détente with China. Remember, the big theme of her 2020 campaign was this is an emergency. We have to thwart the coming so-called new Cold War with China and Russia. Although earlier in her career, she did have slightly more mainstream views on Israel-Palestine, she became much more sharp in her critique of U.S. consensus on the issue of Israel-Palestine. I was at many of her events in late 2019, early 2020, when she was denouncing what she called the illegal occupation of Palestine. She denounced the Trump-Kushner so-called roadmap to peace plan that carved the West Bank into Swiss cheese and then claim that it was an offer of a Palestinian state with no sovereignty, no autonomy, and then use that as a pretext to subsequently orchestrate the so-called Abraham Accords without any input from the Palestinians whatsoever. They've been frozen out, and use that as a try to masquerade the so-called Abraham Accords as a peace plan when it was really an arms deal, an annexation deal. So I thought there were some fairly trenchant critiques that Tulsi Gabbard was making that were very much outside the mainstream in the Democratic Party. I got to know her very well personally. She was maligned by the Democratic Party. She even opposed the first Trump impeachment, which was a huge political risk to her. She cast her vote as present, and she submitted a censure resolution in lieu of the fallacious impeachment that the Democrats ended up going with. And the censure resolution was around issues like abrogating arms deals with Russia. It was around plundering Syria and bombing Syria on false pretenses. It was around extremely legitimate issues. She was the first, I think, Democratic primary candidate to denounce the attempted regime change operation in Venezuela before Bernie Sanders even. So that was my perspective on Tulsi Gabbard at the time. But she clearly made a decision after she left office to transition into becoming a Republican functionary of sorts. She became a paid Fox News contributor. She abandoned her critiques of Trump and focused on kind of towing the same partisan line against the Democrats, first nominally as an independent. And she kind of decided to do this whole, I didn't leave the party, the Democratic Party, the party left me routine that Democratic to Republican converts have done for decades, probably longer, starting with Ronald Reagan. Not starting with him, but Ronald Reagan was among them. Even Trump does that occasionally because I think for a couple of years in the 90s or something, he might have been registered as a Democrat. It's sort of meaningless. And now, Tulsi Gabbard even introduced legislation toward the end of her tenure in Congress that called for the prohibition of all sanctions that lead to civilian suffering. Again, hugely outside the mainstream. That would have, if her legislation got enacted, which of course it never had a chance of getting enacted, but it's in the congressional record, people can go look it up, that would have mandated the removal of sanctions on Iran, on Syria, on Venezuela, perhaps even North Korea, Russia. She was against the entire sanctions regime, which she accurately identified as a tool, ultimately, of imposing regime change. So where are those critiques now? They're totally gone. She decided to become a Republican functionary. In the 2022 midterms, she went around campaigning exclusively for Republicans. And, I think the argument, to the extent there was one, was that she was going to focus on supporting Republicans who were more in keeping with her philosophy, but that she went around and endorsed Chuck Grassley, the senator from Iowa, who's just a bog standard of a Bush Republican as you could ask for. She endorsed Herschel Walker in Georgia, in the Georgia Senate race, and lots of other Republican congressional candidates who had nothing at all in common with her 2020 campaign messaging. So that was, an indicator to me that whatever project I could identify her as having been pursuing in 2020 was gone. And then that culminated with now her endorsing Trump. She attended pro-Israel rallies after October 7th last year. And she makes appearances about Hamas is infiltrating the United States. She always had a slight, she did have a position,
a sort of a progressive on everything except Palestine, but now she's
she did. It is true that she would, even in the 2020 campaign, talk about jihad or the threat of jihad, but she had a different spin on it, where she was saying that U.S. foreign policy is fueling extremist Islamic elements, and that formed her like anti-interventionist perspective. So, but at times it did get a little bit dicey, I'll say. But she, in 2019, you could find it, or maybe it was 2018, you could find a tweet of her famously denouncing Trump as, quote, Saudi Arabia's bitch. That's the terminology she used. Because Trump was just, funneling arms deals to Saudi Arabia, and and sending, you talk about Trump supposedly being a peacenik candidate. He sent more troops to the Middle East to be stationed at Saudi Arabia, to number one, assist in the pulverization of Yemen, and number two, serve as a bulwark against Iran in the event of war. So there were more U.S. troops that were sent to the Middle East under Trump's auspices. And on and on and on with this. There's really no explanation for the about face, I don't think, other than just pursuit of power. And sadly, for me personally, she has participated in what I think is the totally groundless propaganda offensive on behalf of Trump that kind of borrows from the RFK style argument. And I mean, it's sad to see, but politicians shape-shifting in pursuit of power, I guess is nothing new. And unfortunately, she's yet another example of it.
Now, my second to last question is, what do you think the broad church of the left and the anti-imperialist peace movement should do come election day? Should we? I know you did your write-in thing, but should others, you think, vote Green Party or Party for Socialism and Liberation, or hold our nose, suck our pride, vote Democrats to keep the MAGA far-right douchebag Republican Party out of office, but mobilize like hell against the endless austerity imperial agenda of Kamala Harris?
I don't tend to tell people what they should do. I tend to just describe what I do. And if people want to glean any insight from that, that's up to them. But like I said before, I've already voted. People think it's a wasted vote to do a write-in. I think it's even bigger of a waste in New Jersey, given how the write-in votes are tabulated compared to other states, but that's kind of vote election administration minutia. I wrote in Fred Flintstone, okay, for president, because I would much prefer a Flintstone administration than a Harris or a Trump administration. I certainly can't advise people on the left or any other ideological orientation to vote Democrat. I don't think, if you're serious when you claim that a so-called genocide is being perpetrated, I have some sort of irrelevant qualms with that term, not to excuse Israel at all, but I think the term genocide is kind of misused, and it's really just used as a synonym for bad. Like, you don't have to use the term genocide to provide a very comprehensive indictment of what Israel's been doing with U.S. backing, but that's a whole nother discussion. But if you do use that terminology, and you're arguing that the Democratic administration, of which Kamala Harris has been a part, is perpetrating a genocide, it's baffling to me that you could then come up with a convoluted logic for why you then have to vote for them. What would be the line if not that, right? You have AOC, who thought, a perfect example, I think, of the lack of utility of the term genocide is that this past spring, AOC thought that she was being a huge trailblazer by coming out and publicly uttering the word genocide to describe what Israel was doing in Gaza. And then the next week, she turns around and starts campaigning with Biden, taking aviator sunglasses selfies with him, and encouraging her followers to get on board with the Democrats' reelection. I'm sorry, the logic there doesn't add up. So I'm not impressed by people who just go around and shriek genocide, and then it doesn't comport with their other actions. Otherwise, what conclusion should I draw other than you don't actually believe fully what it is that you're saying? You're just engaging in sloganeering. So I can't countenance and the Democrats are virtually universal in their support of the status quo in Ukraine. There wasn't a single Democrat in the entire U.S. Congress that voted against or voiced opposition to the Ukraine component of the National Security Supplemental Bill in April. They refuse to have even a smidgen of self-criticism around what has been a catastrophic policy in Ukraine. Hundreds and hundreds of thousands of needless deaths of Ukrainians and Russians, corpses piling up in the Donbass over what is fundamentally a marginal territorial dispute, has now expanded into something much greater. There's word now of North Korean troops massing on the border in Russia with Ukraine. Trump is not wrong, I don't think, when he says that this could be a precursor to a World War III style scenario. Biden said in the beginnings of the Ukraine intervention around March of 2022 that one of the reasons why he wouldn't support more full-blown U.S. intervention into Ukraine, as extensive as it was at the time, is because it would be an unacceptably high risk of World War III. But then those safeguards were blown past in the ensuing 2.5 years. And now we have a situation where the administration doesn't even say where Ukraine is authorized to use U.S. munitions to strike inside Russia. Ukraine has done land incursions into Russia. They currently, I believe, last I checked, still occupy, with U.S. munitions and support, a part of Russia. I interviewed the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General C.Q. Brown, at a Stratcom symposium in Nebraska in August. And I asked him, what was the U.S. role in enabling Ukraine to launch a cross-border offensive into Russia and occupy Russian territory? And he evaded the question entirely, which leads me to believe that there was an intensive U.S. role in the Ukrainian land incursion into Russia, as one would expect, because Ukraine would likely not exist as a state right now if not for U.S. largesse. So for the Democrats to be so unanimous in their utter refusal to re-examine this policy in any respect, I think is disqualifying. Now, is Trump the answer in that regard? No. Trump escalated in Ukraine while he was in power. He himself has said accurately that U.S.-Russia relations plummeted to dangerous new lows under his tenure. Yes, some of that was in part due to the Democrats and their hysteria around Russiagate, which, again, created a perverse incentive for more aggressive policy toward Russia. But nonetheless, he was in power. The buck stopped with him. And Trump says now that he has a secret plan to magically solve the war in 24 hours. Apparently, although he's been running for president literally for nearly 2 years, none of us can see this plan. It's reminiscent of when Richard Nixon ran in 1968 on similar grounds, saying he had a secret plan. He didn't use the word secret plan, but he claimed to have a plan to solve the Vietnam War. And then what did he do when he came into power? He started bombing Cambodia. So I'm not going to tell people that there are better options available than there are. And I agree somewhat with what David was saying earlier, which is that people put way too much significance on when they stroll into a voting booth every 4 years and check a box on a form. I don't put that much stock in it. In part because, I do have the luxury of having somewhat of a platform to engage with political affairs well beyond the affordance that I'm given every 4 years of casting a vote. But most people don't, so I get that. I just I think that there are huge perils for both Harris and Trump if they were to get into power. In terms of Israel, I mean, Trump, the only critique that he has of the Democratic administration on Israel is that they haven't been bellicose enough in their support of Netanyahu. He claims that the Democrats are in hock to anti Semites and are trying to save Hamas by furnishing this massive supply of armaments virtually without restriction for the past year. And the Republicans, for all RFK likes to claim that they're the party that is going to safeguard free speech, I've never seen a more brazen attack on I shouldn't say never. I have rarely seen a more brazen attack on speech than the Republicans have advanced over the past year when it comes to speech critical of Israel. Trump, as he parades around with Miriam Adelson, one of his chief funders, pouring $100 million into the Trump campaign operation because that's what her and her late husband Sheldon did in 2016 and 2020, and they reaped massive rewards from it. Meaning, Trump gave them everything that they could have possibly wanted in terms of the most hardline pro-Israel policy, outdoing even Barack Obama and George W. Bush. I mean, people forget, but George W. Bush was the first U.S. president to at least nominally endorse a Palestinian state. It didn't amount to anything, but Trump has really dropped the pretense. I mean, he essentially the Trump administration was the first administration to send the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, who Trump is pledging to reinstall into power, to the West Bank to sanction or to signal U.S. approval of Jewish settlements in the West Bank. And the so-called peace plan that Kushner produced called for the annexation, but formal annexation by Israel of around 30% of the West Bank, and then would give the Palestinians a non-quasi state that was consisted of like lots of unarable desert. Yeah, and like I said, Trump.
So a pox on both their houses.
Well, yeah. So I mean, so I guess just to conclude, because I could go on forever, as you could probably tell. I just don't. I mean, I disagree with David and maybe you. I'm not sure about this supposed imperative to vote for the Democrats as a means of warding off the Republicans, because I think that even if you just want to focus on Israel, the policy has been such a nightmare that it would seem unconscionable for me to countenance it. Not that I understand people might disagree, but the only solution that I can proffer is to withhold my consent from either of them. And I don't find any of the third parties really particularly credible either. Again, separate discussion we could have, but that's my prescription. And again, I don't tell people what to do. I just give my rationale for what I do, and then people can take what they want from it.
Interesting. Well, we end the program now doing the questionnaire that was done by Marcel Proust, later the popular late French broadcaster Bernard Pivot, and then my hero, the late great James Lipton of Inside the Actors Studio. Michael, it's your turn to do this before I let you enjoy the rest of your afternoon and have dinner and whatnot. What is your favorite word?
My favorite word?
Yeah.
One of my favorite words, I'll give you one of them. One of my favorite word is brazen, B-R-A-Z-E-N.
Okay.
Because there is so much that's brazenly done, usually backed by some outlandish deceit or with some comical shamelessness, that I do think brazen often captures the lack of shame that people have when they perpetrate one of these actions or utter something that is just totally nonsensical. So people will like brazenly lie or brazenly claim things are true that aren't. So I tend to maybe even slightly overuse that word, but maybe that's just a sign that it's one of my favorites.
Then that being said, what's your least favorite word?
One of my least favorite word. Okay. Problematic, I think, is my least favorite word. People That's part of like the new liberal-ish lingo where like everything where you can't say why something is wrong. You have to just gesture that it's problematic and kind of come up with this weird therapeutic moralism around it where you can't give a logical argument as to why the thing is objectionable. You have to just say it's problematic because like it offends some sensibility or something. That's one of my least favorite words.
So, oh my gosh, Zionists do that all the time. Then what's then what sour noise do you love, followed by what sour noise do you dislike?
What noise?
What sound or noise do you love?
Oh, what sound or noise? Okay.
And then what sound or noise do you dislike?
Well, I do have to say I have to because I live over a major road here in Jersey City, and the noise pollution. I've been able to like tune it out, but the sound of police sirens, I think, is my least favorite noise, or even emergency vehicles. One of my private conspiracy theories that I don't claim to have proof for is that a lot of these so-called emergencies that somehow necessitate the blaring emergency sounds and lights are like not real emergencies and just allow cops and other vehicles to get through traffic quicker. Like I've seen cops put on their emergency sirens and lights and just go through a red light and then turn them off. So you could excuse me for being a bit doubtful as to the veracity of a lot of those sirens. In terms of a favorite noise, I do like sound of birds chirping.
Okay,
I think that puts me that puts me in a state of tranquility.
Oh, that's nice. Then what's your favorite curse word then?
My favorite curse word.
Yeah.
I try not to be too reliant on profanity, but every now and then you have to just let loose, right? So I like fucking, the word fucking when it's used as an infix. So like abso-fucking-lutely. That's my favorite.
Then what turns you on psychologically, emotionally, and spiritually, followed by what turns you off?
What turns me on?
Yeah.
Okay. So not sexually, I hope you're
exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. Like psychologically, spiritually, or emotionally.
I'm quote turned on in that sense by well-reasoned argumentation. I really am. Like when I can engage with somebody, even if we disagree passionately, but you can engage, where you can have like a dialectical exchange where you come up with new insights because you have to test your own argument soundness, and your interlocutor has coherence to what they're saying. They're not just like spewing propaganda or duplicitously trying to deflect or dissemble. That I appreciate. And what turns me off is the opposite of that, when people do attempt to engage under the guise of genuine interaction, but it's really just a ruse. And within a few questions, or within a few kind of prongs down the argumentative ladder, they reveal themselves as having no coherence to what they're saying, other than they want to make some vacuous point, or like do a personal attack or whatever.
And I actually have to pay you a compliment for that. That's actually why people should check out your interview with Dr. Ron Paul, and should check out your interview with Peter Hitchens.
Oh yeah, those are from a while ago. Yep, that's funny. That's his book on drugs, isn't it? Exactly. Yeah. I enjoy both of those people. Those are from 2017, I think, back when I was with the Young Turks.
Yeah. Then what profession, if you weren't doing the fantastic independent journalism you do and going on the road reporting and interviews, so if you weren't doing that, what would you love to do?
I don't know that I'd be any good at anything else. I'd probably like be living under a bridge or something. So I'm not sure I have a great answer.
That's more or less the same thing with me. Then what profession would you absolutely not want to do under any circumstance?
I mean, there have been times. There have been times in the past where I had to do like quote unquote regular job, and I just I could just feel the soul draining out of me. So I'm not sure it would have been sustainable.
Then what profession would you absolutely not want to do under any circumstances? Then
PR. A lot of journalists, given the precarity of the industry, like I mean, I'm sort of unique in that I have like I'm like a small business owner or something. Like I'm an independent proprietor. So it's relatively sustainable for me, but for others who came up through more traditional journalistic routes, like the classic trajectory is like you can become a junior reporter at a local or regional newspaper and like you work your way up. That career path is not really accessible anymore for the most part. So a lot of former journalists often tend to go into PR. And to me, PR is like the ultimate antithesis of journalism. So like you're you're using the whatever skills you learned to advance the exact opposite project. So yeah, PR is what I couldn't do.
Completely agree with you on that. Final question is, if heaven exists, what would you like to hear God say as you arrive at the pearly gates, or whatever is your vision of the afterlife? And even if you're an atheist, please do answer this question.
Yeah, if heaven, so we're presuming that heaven does exist, even if we have an atheistic outlook on that question.
You never know. You never know. As Woody Allen says, you know, as the Woody Allen character, Boris says, you know, in the film Love and Death, Boris, don't say such a crazy thing. If there was no heaven, life would be meaningless. You might as well kill yourself. Hey, let's not get hysterical here. I'd hate to blow my brains out and find out the next day in the paper that there is a God. So, so again, even if you're a complete atheist, and answer the question.
Well, I think if Henry Kissinger is wherever I end up, hopefully God would banish me to the opposite supernatural realm.
So, well, I doubt you would be sent to hell, and not knowing anything about your
I'll take purgatory.
Exactly. Like, I think most of us who still have some skeletons in our closet that we have to sort out, at best purgatory is probably like the most overpopulated. No, the second most overpopulated place. Hell is definitely overpopulated with so many people who deserve to be there, and like Henry Kissinger. Well, on that note, we are joined on this epic edition of 1+1 with David Swanson, who is the host of Talk World Radio on Pacifica Radio and his own YouTube channel and SoundCloud. He's a high-ranking member of World Beyond War, a very great peace group, anti-war, anti-imperialist organization, and also part of rootsaction.org. I'll remind people that he is the author of several books like Leaving World War II Behind, which is fantastic, and When the World Outlaws War. NATO, What You Need to Know and Do, co-authored with Code Pinks and Dia Benjamin. Also, War is Never Just, War is a Lie, War No More, The Case for Abolition, and Killing is Not a Way of Life. And folks should check out his website, davidswanson.org, where he blogs regularly, as well as World Beyond War's website. And, of course, we were also joined a very surprised guest. We were so lucky to have him on such short notice. Michael Tracy, independent journalist, reporter, and commentator whose writings have been in several publications, former TYT reporter and interviewer. And folks can check him out at his Substack. Folks can check him out at his own YouTube channel. I'll make sure to link to all of that. Both of you gentlemen, thank you so much. Michael, thank you so much for coming on the program and doing a much needed myth busting that needs to be due, because I have been getting so fed up with people saying that Donald Trump is a peacenik, and the folks who propped up both RFK Jr. So, folks, please check out their work. And, of course, folks, also donate generously to 1+1 and do share widely. And, again, Michael, thank you so much for coming on the program. It was such an honor to talk to you, and I hope that this will be the first of many conversations that we have both both on and off the air.
Well, I certainly agree with the necessity of myth busting right about now, so I enjoyed it.
Thank you.